There's two sorts of risks that you've got to be aware of. The first one is that you're going to crowd out other sources, other spending priorities. And the second one associated with that is that you may be choosing public-private partnerships for the wrong reasons, and in the long run they may be a more expensive option than traditional forms of procurement. The second sort of risk that arises is through fiscal shocks. If you have a contract structure which is ill-defined, you, as a government, may be picking up the pieces of a failed contract, and this can lead to very large increases in public debt if you're not careful. So the ways to try and address these sorts of problems, the fiscal risks associated with public-private partnerships, is to be involved in all the stages of the contracting, from the very initial decisions of why you should be using a public-private partnership, making sure that you have the appropriate, robust and decision-making to select the appropriate projects and the appropriate financing needs, and then follow the project through to make sure that as the project is ongoing, that there's no slippage and risks are not emerging, so you can react quickly to emerging problems. The key message there is the decision-making process, that you really have to concentrate on this. Public-private partnerships are typically an expensive option in comparison with traditional procurement, and that is necessary. You need to invest heavily up front to make sure that you're doing the right thing, but over the life of the project it will reap returns if you make that initial investment. More specifically for the budget, you need to make sure that all the costs are as transparent as possible. Now, there are lots of accounting difficulties associated with bringing a project which is typically multi-annual or can last up to 30, 40 years in some cases, with an annual budget process. So the importance here is to make sure that you have supplementary documents to the budgets to say that these projects are being approved, and spelling out the fiscal implications both in the short term, medium term and the long term, so you can see transparently what the real costs associated with these projects are and whether it's going to make your budget sustainable or unsustainable in the longer term. So that's a very important framework for putting in place to guard against the associated fiscal risks. Another problem, let's say a supplementary issue, is to do with the risks of renegotiation. The contracts, as we mentioned, are very expensive to set up in the first place, and often once the public sector has engaged in the project, the private partner may come back and say that conditions have changed and we want to renegotiate the terms of the agreement. Again, this is a risk that the government should recognise exists, so when it's looking at the longer term fiscal consequences, you can already start to say that we know that there is a risk of renegotiation which will change the terms of the project, have various scenarios to show what would happen given the different sorts of risks, whether they materialise or not. And I think finally also on that subject, the final thing is to recognise that there are going to be problems with renegotiation, so build them into the beginning of your contract. Try to specify the terms that you will allow renegotiation to occur, so it can only be on certain defined topics that you and the private sector both agree in advance, and that will help the government manage some of these sorts of risks associated with PPPs.